Good day. My name is Jim Kellam, and I represent the OTA International Classification of Fractures and Dislocation Committee. I'm here today to discuss with you the revisions for the 2018 Fracture and Dislocation Classification Compendium that is soon to be released. I would first like to thank the members of the committee for their tireless work. Julie Agel, Matthew Karam, and Craig Roberts, who represented the Orthopedic Trauma Association, and Eric Meinberg, along with myself, who represented the AO Trauma International Board. This took a lot of work, and the committee members were dedicated, and I want to thank them for their commitment to this process. I'd also like to thank the individuals at AO Education, Jekka Reitmuth, Marcel Ersman, and Carl Lau, who have been instrumental in making sure that this got to publication, as well as Kathleen Caswell of the Orthopedic Trauma Association and Robin Green, also of AO Education, who have been individuals who have made sure that this process has been done properly. Let's begin with learning objectives. We're going to understand why this classification revision is important. We'll describe the revisions through terminology, the introduction of the universal modifiers and qualifications, and the two bone systems of the body and why we've gone to separate codes for the bones. And finally, we will outline the coding structure changes in the new compendium. The AO-OTA classification system sprung out of the comprehensive classification of long bones that Maurice Muller published in 1987. With its translation by Professor Joseph Schatzker in 1990, it became known in the English world. At that time in 1996, the AO and the OTA agreed to combine using the principles of the classification system to attempt to classify all the fractures that occur in the appendicular skeleton. This created the compendium that was first published in 1996. Also in this publication, it was agreed by both organizations that there would be a 10-year review process. This is now the second review process, the first being in 2007. We are going to base this on the glossary of terms that provides us with a standard for all fracture and bone dislocations and fractures. This is important because it allows us to communicate with each other in a very precise manner. It gives us a systematic approach which is applicable in all situations based usually upon the severity of the fracture. And as well, there is an alphanumerical code which allows for database documentation for clinical research and use in the clinics. To begin with, the first terminology change was the removal of the word complex in the diaphyseal section as a type C fracture. This was replaced with the term multifragmentary, which has also been used in the diaphysis, but did not have a letter or a number. It was felt by many people that this made much more sense in describing the fracture pattern. Hence, we now have, for diaphyseal fracture types, a simple, which is A, wedge, which is B, and multifragmentary, which is C. If we look at this in more detail, we have not changed the definition of a wedge fracture. This has remained the fact that it will have proximal and distal fracture fragments touching to give you length and alignment. What we've changed here is the removal of a spiral and bending, as these were difficult to determine whether people understood what they really were and could classify the fractures in this manner. It's been replaced by intact as one piece, which is a 2, and fragmentary wedge, which is a 3, this being one in many pieces. Again, the definition remains. Spiral and bending, if you are wanted to be used, are in the universal modifiers, which I will explain later. The multifragmentary or type C fracture, again, is defined exactly like the complex, in that if you take it away, there's no contact between the main fragments. Again, because the treatment of this fracture is essentially the same nowadays with an intermedullary nail, the definition or the differentiation between a spiral multifragmentary one and an irregular one is probably not necessary. Hence, we've changed this to the fact that we now have an intact segmental and a fragmentary segmental fracture, being B's and C's. The next area was addressed was the constant criticism of the proximal end segment of the humerus. To this, we've placed the near classifications of the parts. This has been something that has been asked for many years and is now there and will help people use this classification. As well, we've looked at defining the C fractures in a more definite way. We removed the displacement criteria, which is extremely subjective and very difficult to make consistent coding with, and have only dealt with the morphology of the fracture. This has reduced the number of codes here and has made it much more simpler and much easier to use. Again, proximal femur had issues with regards to the definition of pertrochanteric and trochanteric. After extensive review by us and by other people that we contacted and consulted, the terminology pertrochanteric will remain a fracture through both trochanters, as shown in the line. An intertrochanteric fracture is a fracture that goes between the trochanters or across the femur, such as the reverse oblique fracture that is presently known. Consequently, these two terminologies will remain intact. The other area that is particularly a problem here is what determines stability in the intertrochanteric fracture region. We have used this time the lateral wall thickness as a mechanism of determining the difference between an A1 and an A2. In the compendium, the exact methodology of determining this is outlined, but it is important to realize that perhaps this will make the differentiation between A1 and A2 fractures much more simpler and more well-defined. The femoral neck region has been revised to bring the subcapital fractures all up into the B1 level. Initially, a B3-3, or a completely displaced subcapital fracture, was in the B3s. It is now brought up onto the B1s as a B1-3 to basically align the various fracture types. The B2s are all femoral necks, and the B3 now is a basicervical. In the B2 group, we have added the Powell's classification to better define those high-energy injuries in this region. And finally, with the femoral head, or the 31Cs, we've removed all the basic associated acetabular fracture codes because it is important when coding these fractures that one code for the femoral head is used and then a separate acetabular code. So both fractures need to be coded, and hence there will be two codes. And again, this simplifies this region as well. The next area of revision has been with the radius and ulna. Initially, these bones have been classified together in a two-bone system. This has become very difficult for us to do with complex fractures about the proximal end segment, such as the terrible triad and the transolecranon fracture dislocation. If one separates this, then it becomes much easier to do. So in this point, at this time, the radius and ulna will be classified as separate individual fractures. The end segment will be determined exactly as before using both bones, as this makes consistency in providing the fractures in this region to be able to be coded properly. Hence, the coding of fractures will now start with a 2 for the forearm, uppercase R or U for the ulna, and then followed at that stage by the location, the type, and the group in a separate way. But each fracture will have its own separate code. This is shown in this example of a multifragmentary fracture of the radius and the ulna. Both fractures will have a code, such as you can see here, and then in the database, this patient will have these two codes inputted so that you can define these fractures in a much better way. The Galeazzi-Monteggia fracture in this system will be identified by a G for Galeazzi and an M for Monteggia. The fracture of the bone will be classified, and then in a rounded bracket, a G or M will be added. Should you wish to classify the direction of dislocation of the involved joint, this is possible through a universal modifier, as I will show you later. The second two-bone system is the tibia and fibula. Because there has never been a fibular code, this has never been a problem. However, numerous people have requested this over the years. A fibular code has been created using the definitions that have been proposed by Mueller. There is a proximal end segment, a distal end segment, and a diaphyseal segment divided into thirds. The end segments are basically simple, being simple fracture or multifragmentary fracture. The diaphyseals codes goes down as far as the type is concerned. So in order to classify this, you can use a 4, an uppercase F, the location, followed by the type and the group as is required. For the tibia, there is no need to use a T, as this code has been there for a while and is not a big problem with it. This brings us to what we call the universal modifiers. In the old compendiums, there were numerous qualifications and modifiers for each of the fractures. When we reviewed these, many were found to be involved with the fracture morphology, displacement, associated injury, and location, but were generalizable to most fractures. We removed these and placed them into a list, which now allows you to choose for any fracture a universal modifier. These follow the code in a square bracket, and you can use as many as you want separated by a column. The following shows you the list of modifiers. These are better defined in the compendium, but you can see that we're dealt with dislocation direction or dislocation. We have an articular cartilage injury based on the International Cartilage Society's system, one for poor bone quality, reimplantation, and other aspects that become related to the fracture itself. For example, this 3-part bifocal proximal humerus fracture dislocation with displacement, anterior dislocation, and osteopenia is classified as a 1B1.1, followed by the square brackets 2 for displacement, 5A for anterior dislocation, and 9 to represent poor bone quality or osteopenia, thus giving you a very, very well-defined but simple way of classifying the fracture with other aspects. The other aspect that we brought in were the qualifications. Qualifications deal with specific fracture morphology and are fracture specific. Again, like the universal modifiers, these are optional and can be used by the user whenever they want. Multiple qualifications can be used, separated by a comma, and are placed in rounded brackets as well. There are asterisks throughout the codes where these are to go because that is the specific area that they will be involved with. For this example, this is a humerus, proximal end segment, articular or 4-part, valgus impacted. The code is 11C 1.1. However, both tuberosities have been fractured. Now, tuberosities only exist in the proximal humerus. Consequently, this is a qualification. It's P, and it's placed in a rounded brackets to follow. So as you can see, it is now an 11C 1.1 with rounded brackets P to tell you both tuberosities are fractured. If you want to add in the anterior dislocation, this again is a universal modifier. It can now be done with a square bracket and 5A. Although this may seem complex, it is allowed, and it's up to the user who is doing this whether these are important for them and how detailed one wants. But we felt that this gave us a simple, easy way to solve many of the different problems that were associated in the past compendiums with the multiple modifiers. Another qualification that we did add was to take into account the recent interests in defining in the proximal tibia where there is displacement of the fracture. And hence, thanks to Maurizio Caffuri and Joe Schatzker, we are using a proposal that they have come up with by dividing the proximal tibia into quadrants, and these have now been labeled anterolateral, posterior lateral, anteromedial, and posterior medial, and may be used as a qualifier to determine where the fracture is and where the displacement has occurred in the proximal tibia. Dislocations are classified, and this has been simplified. The 0 represents a dislocation. The consistency in this now is that the first number will represent the bone that is dislocated. There is a third character, an A, B, or C, which will represent the various joints in that joint complex if there are multiple joints, such as the elbow, which has basically 3 joints involved with it. And then finally, there is a direction letter, which will tell you which way it has gone. This can be added, as I mentioned before, as a universal modifier to the system. In this situation, we have an anterior dislocation of the knee, bicruciate with collaterals intact. The bone displaced is the tibia, hence 4. 0 for dislocation, 5A for anterior dislocation, and we have added the Scheck classification as qualifiers it's a bracket B, and hence you now have a code for a dislocated anterior dislocation of the knee. Fracture dislocations, however, are coded as a fracture followed by the dislocation direction, which is a universal modifier in the 5 category. And hence, if you see here, a posterior wall fracture dislocation of the acetabulum codes the posterior wall and then adds to it 5B, which means dislocation posterior, and now you have that in the system for you, should you wish to use it. The other area of confusion has been the isolated medial or isolated malleolar fractures. And this just shows you that in this circumstance, an isolated malleolar fracture, medial or posterior, without articular or malleolar involvement of the fibula, are classified as partial articular distal end segment fractures, 43Bs. And this simplifies this so people understand. However, if there is a fibular injury, it is an ankle fracture and therefore will be a malleolar fracture, such as you can see here in the standard definitions that we have of the A, B, and C fracture patterns around the ankle. The alphanumerical code has slightly changed. There was a hyphen, as you know, between location and type. This causes confusion and problems in database entry and database searching, and hence has been recommended to us to remove the hyphen. So the hyphen has been removed, and as you can see now, there's very little difference. It's bone, location, type, group, period, subgroup, followed by qualifications and universal modifiers, depending on where these will go for you. So this is the new structure for the alphanumerical coding system. We have also changed into the area where you have multiple bones, such as the hand, foot, and thorax. And in this area, the way we have decided to do it is the first number will be the anatomical region. Second number is the bone involved. The third number becomes the specific bone, and this is placed between 2 dots. And then finally, you end up with the bone segment and then the rest of the code. Just to show you how simple this really is, if you have a fracture of the third metacarpal, which is a wedge in the diaphysis, you classify this basically, the hand and carpus is 7. Metacarpals are known as 7 in the hand and wrist area. The digit is the third one, that is .3. Diaphyseal fractures segment has always been 2, and a wedge is B. Although this appears complex, it does now allow us the ability to classify hand and foot fractures in a logical manner at this time. One of the issues that you will see, and it's not a big problem, is because of some of the codes have been changed or dropped because they aren't used, it created a gap. And rather than bring the fractures together and change a whole series of codes, we have allowed the gaps to remain so that the coding numbers stay the same as in the other compendiums. That's to mean that searching becomes a little easier at the time you need to do it because we haven't changed a series of codes for you. The other thing we have done is we have added into the compendium new validated classifications. The OTA open fracture classification, which has been validated, the Unified Classification of Periprosthetic Fractures, the AO-OTA scapular fracture classification, and the AO spine subaxial cervical and thoracospine classification, as well as the sacral classification, are all new validated classifications. The thorax codes for ribs and sternal fractures is new. This is a proposal, and it is now added for comment and suggestions by the AOTK thorax group of surgeons who are interested in creating a classification here. We have also added other existing classifications, the Young-Burgess classification to pelvic ring injuries and the Hawkins-Canale classification to talar neck fractures, as well as the others that have existed in the past. In summary, we hope that this has clarified terminology and made it much more understanding. We have changed the codes, not significantly, but come up with the idea of separate coding of radius, ulna, tibia, and fibular fractures to make it easier and more universal for fracture classification. We've introduced the qualifications and universal modifiers. We have tried to address the constant ongoing issues of the proximal humerus and proximal femur. We hope we've simplified the process and we've added the new relevant validated classifications that presently exist. So in summary, the take-home message is that we believe that the 2018 classification compendium will be a little more streamlined, more concise, and clinically relevant for you for coding fractures and dislocations, as well as discussing these with colleagues and friends and for your research. I thank you for your time, and I hope this has been very helpful to you in teaching the classification to those individuals who are interested in it. Thank you.